Okay, good evening. Welcome to this event. Unfortunately, there's been a bit of a mix-up with the Zoom link, but what we're going to do is we're going to record the session and re-release it later this evening, for example, just to make sure that the people who wanted to attend the event but couldn't find the correct link can still access it. But Dr. Andrew Atter is joining us from Pivomo, and he's going to give us a workshop on how to better manage startup teams. So Andrew, I'll pass it over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Harrison, and good evening, everyone. I hope you're all safe and well wherever you are. It's difficult times everywhere, and I'm beaming this from Liverpool, which is in a kind of a tier 3 semi sort of lockdown state. So it's it's a dramatic time to be talking about all these things, but I think it does tend to reinforce just how vital and how critical entrepreneurship will be as we try and sort of rebuild our way out of this situation. So really glad to be here. I'm thrilled to be working with Edinburgh entrepreneurs. I've got a strong association with Edinburgh because my son went to Edinburgh University and found a job afterwards. So there's hope there. So just stay with it, and it's all going to turn out okay. So I'm here to talk about what I've entitled Building Effective Startup Teams, because my pitch on this is that there is actually nothing more important to entrepreneurship than building an effective team. So I'll share some experiences. So I've got about 20 minutes of content, if that's okay with everyone. I've got, there is a little bit of theory. I'm going to share some research, share some case studies. But there are some questions that I've got at the end, which I can pose, and so I know this is being recorded, so Harrison and your team, you can use this as kind of content if you want to run a workshop, and those questions I think will be relevant to whichever sort of startup audience you're working with. So I'll plow on, and by all means interrupt me if there's any questions, challenges. Don't hold back, because key thing is we can sort of share this content together. So I'll plow on and just give you a summary of the kind of key points I want to talk about, which I'll come back to. So I think the first point I'd make is it is absolutely critical that founders at the early stage think critically about the right team, what that means. And I'll come on to define, give you a view that there are different types of teams in a minute. But I think, really early on, and the point I'd make is in the beginning, building the right team is more important than the right product or the right strategy. And that may seem controversial, and it probably is contradicted by a lot of what you read and hear about startups and how important product is and how important the right vision and strategy is. But I absolutely believe that the startup team, as it forms, starts to shape the visions and formulate the strategy, and having the right team in place both allows you to develop the right product, but also, and crucially, adapts the products as you start to learn more about the different landscape and the different markets and consumer behavior. If you put too much emphasis early on just to plow on and get into sort of product building or strategizing, etc., and you don't have the right people in the room, a lot of that work has to be redone anyway. So that's kind of the first point I'll come back to. Teams come in different shapes and sizes. There is not we have this construct called team, and there's a lot of literature that tends to direct you in one or a couple of particular directions, but there's actually huge diversity in shape and size of teams, which is something that's important to know and think about. And the one thing I would stress is teams are more investable. So certainly angels prefer teams, VCs prefer teams, and it certainly presents better at competitions and so on. And think about, not least because we know that diverse teams with a good mix of gender and ethnicity perform better and are generally liked, and that's all about the dangers of groupthink and other things. So there's a lot of research on that. So adapting your behavior to each team type is essential. So, you know, each team comes with it a certain mindset and behavior, and but all founders, not just the original founder, but all of the founders need to adapt in the appropriate way to make that work. So those are the kind of key points I just wanted to headline. I'm going to plow on unless there's any questions, but I first of all wanted to, and Harrison, I'm looking at you on the screen, so you're in the front line of this question. It applies to you as well. Who knows the story of William Douglas, Lord of Liddesdale? Anybody? This will show those who went on the enriching tours of Edinburgh rather than staying too long in the library, right? Anybody? I can't see anybody responding on the chat box yet. No? Okay, well, this is something you do need to know. You absolutely mustn't leave this webinar not knowing who Lord of Liddesdale is. He was in the 1330s through the 1340s, he ran and formed an armed band to fight against King Edward, living in poverty and living in the shadows, which I think is quite appropriate to many startup teams. So there will be a certain connection or bond you may feel with Lord Douglas. But you know, what he's famous for is capturing Edinburgh Castle, of course. But he did this by dressing as merchants and then jumping out of the hay wains, these, you know, the hay wagons, surprising the defenders. And he managed to capture a very well fortified castle. So there's all kinds of meaning and metaphors in there, which I think is pretty obvious. Some investors might think that you know, people jumping out of hay wains and surprising them might be exactly what they experienced with startups, but that's for a different presentation. And he became known as the flail of the English and the wall of the Scots. However, there's a sting in the tail, and this is a kind of an important startup lesson, that he ultimately failed because he didn't have his legal claims in place, right? He didn't have the right legal claims. So actually, he ended up having to give the castle back after all of that because he couldn't hold it. So do take note of William Douglas, Lord of Liddesdale. He was the original startup founder and disruptor. So there's it's an interesting startup story. So just in terms of introduction myself, what I've been doing, I'll go through this very quickly. LSE 86, which is ancient history for most of you, I think, and I just ended up in Heinz, so I had a sort of very corporate role, but also doing some entrepreneurial work in Eastern Europe at that time as well, so mainly UK based. I ended up in Hong Kong 1994 to 2004, and I joined after spending quite a bit of time in consulting. I moved to a client, New World, and we set up the sort of technology division, which then had a portfolio of about 23 .com companies, which we actually used to call them .com, .coms. And of course, so we launched several companies onto the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. And that all came crashing down, as you can probably imagine. But the software we developed, actually, we did a merger and acquisition in China with Jetco, and so there is a legacy there. So Yvette Ong, who's the CEO there, is best boss I ever had. Is still, actually, she's now CEO of Mongolian Power, which tells you a lot about how good feminine leaders are. So I moved to Eastern Europe and in Poland, but also working across Eastern Europe and Russia. And I built a sort of coaching and mentoring team, and we worked with sort of corporates expanding into Eastern Europe at that time. So that was a licensing business, actually. So Marshall Goldsmith is a US coach. I think you can see that. But so I was entrepreneur in residence at Birkbeck University of London for 2 years. It's fabulous. I love that. My best job ever. I had a great time. I still do some work at Birkbeck, as a research fellow. I got my doctorate in 2015 from Middlesex. Oops, what is it? Oops, I've gone too far. Hang on. Sorry about this. I'll go through that quickly. And then I launched Pivomo shortly after, which is designed, actually has an entrepreneurial learning tool which you can access. There is a free version, I'll give you links at the end, and you can create your own entrepreneurial profile. And it began life as a research tool. So some of the research I'll talk about actually was completed on the dynamic instrument that is available on the Pivomo platform. Because that research started in about 2000 and, well, the on-ground research about 2012 through to about 2015, and has continued after in different versions. Now on the third version of the questionnaire. We launched a startup simulator, which is a game. So some of the themes I'm going to talk about, you can experiment with in the startup simulator, which is available on the game stores. It's also available on the website Pivomo Online Learning, which is a new platform we've launched. So we'll be moving from pivomo.com to the new online learning platform very soon, but we're running 2 websites at the moment, which makes life quite interesting. Anyway, that's me. So any questions on that, let me know. So I'll go through that again, sorry. So the key point here is, I think when teams come together, you're bringing yourselves into a team, and that means, which is actually a lot more difficult than it sounds, because as human beings, we actually we bring a lot of baggage and cognitive models into any team, and getting alignment on that while you're building a startup with a high level of volatility and uncertainty is difficult. It's not, we're not built for that, actually. The first thing is mindset, and mindsets in the plural very often may contrast, may not necessarily at the beginning, but so for example, you may have certain similar goals, but your values may differ. Your motivational patterns may differ. Some people are motivated by power and control, and other people are motivated by achievement. And affiliation, for example. So mindsets can be very different, and this emerges over time. These mindsets give rise to different behavioral patterns. So sometimes you may really like someone as a friend, you set up a venture with them, 3 or 4 mates, besties, whatever, and it all seems to be fun at the beginning, but then some unusual patterns start to, you start to see things in people that you didn't notice before, and the working relationship is different from the friendship that you may have had, and that happens a lot in student startups. So I mean, the thing to be aware of is to be aware of that, really talk it through, and I think this is going to be a theme I'm going to come back to, is be ready to disentangle yourself from teams if it gets difficult or complicated, because otherwise you end up with broken friendships and derailed startups. So notice the signs early on, talk about it, try and resolve it, but there is a point at which you have to kind of disengage, learn, and move on. And entrepreneurs do that all the time. I know there's a strong emphasis on never give up, but also entrepreneurs are very good at saying, you know what, this isn't working, I better move on to plan B. I've got another 2 or 3 ideas coming along down the track. And so, and having options available is a very entrepreneurial kind of way of acting. So I think that's important. And so, work style, the way in which we work, are you very planful, methodical, organized, or are you more spontaneous and emergent and responsive? And these different work styles can cause problems, but importantly, they can also, if you get it right, this is where the magic comes. This is where it's kind of Liverpool Football Club starts to work. This is where you've got people with different styles and different kind of approaches blended together in the right way, or complementing, I should say, not blending, complementing each other in the right way, is actually the magic of teams. And so you can actually do a lot more together than you can do by yourself with Zone, the kind of zone of proximal development. Right? And in achieving that, there's all kinds of trade-offs. So there is, do you believe in yourself and self-awareness? So, in teams, are you self-confident, assertive, direct, but also are you aware of your own kind of shortcomings and blind spots? So there's a kind of trade-off there. there's agency and collaboration. So do you have free will? So one of the frustrations people have when they start working in teams is that they suddenly feel constrained. So CTO, for example, wanting to explore certain technical dimensions and having the freedom to experiment in certain ways may contradict a commercial, the marketing officer, and who's got a particular view about the way to face the market. So how much agency do you give each other as startup founders to kind of act freely and independently from a team position? And collaboration is great because, of course, it can be hugely inventive and productive and so on, but it can also be very constraining. The fact that you've got to do everything with other people can be, for people who've got an independent mindset, that can be quite difficult. Agility and tenacity, as I've just mentioned already, when do you just act or turn on a sixpence, which is a very entrepreneurial attribute, the idea of quickly adapting, identifying problems and pivoting. I mean, that's where the company name comes from, pivotal moments. It's a very entrepreneurial feature, but also being tenacious is important too. And so when do you kind of just hang in there and just kind of see it through? And that's a very difficult trade-off. And the point I'm making here, and same with resilience and realism and vision and curiosity, is these trade-offs have to be agreed within the team continuously and negotiated and renegotiated in the light of unfolding events. And this is why it's very difficult in startups. It's actually easier in the corporate environment, given, I can remember back when you got in the corporate world, you typically have weeks or months. It generally, the sort of life cycles of projects and so on, generally speaking, you can plan it over longer cycles. Not always, but quite often is the case. So anyway, so that's, we're going to move on. So we can obviously come back to this. So different types of teams. I would categorize them based on research I did, which is now covering 26 countries, and we've been working with over 30 universities around the world, and many tech accelerators, etc., and several thousands of entrepreneurs and founders. Is I would say that that there are the categories kind of in sort of four. Well, first of all, kind of startup teams succeed when there is goal alignment, and also there's a kind of motivational alignment, and that's the most important thing, that you're motivated towards a thing. And this is the kind of key thing here. You start right, which is important, but also you exit well. Very often what gets overlooked by startup founders is the exit, and I'll come on to talking about 4 teams in a short while when we talk about it's how you leave. So in some ways, for example, a startup may not grow into a large successful company. Very few do actually, but you can still create value and sell the company on and exit, right? And that's also quite, but the important thing is you do that with some consensus in the team. That's what you want, right? So I think I would categorize them into 4. I think there's mission teams, which are really about change the world. This is about, there is a overridingly passionate goal that you adhere to. This is particularly true, I think, of social enterprises. Things like food safety, and so on are absolutely, but also you may have a visionary founder or co-founders who are driven towards a particular large goal. This is a lifelong mission, right? And teams that are hired in to work for these organizations tend to be employed by and work for the CEO founder, charismatic leader, right? The other type of team is very different. It's more of a deal-orientated team. It's associated with consultancy and those project teams, they're network teams. You come and go for particular jobs. You kind of assemble for a deal, complete the deal, and then reassemble. Right. This is a kind of a trader kind of act. So a network of traders who kind of pull together. A global supply chain, for example, may actually be quite small companies, but they are networked. And they might not actually, in this context, use the word team, although really they exhibit team behaviors. Project teams is another one, which is probably more the kind of conventional team in the sense that a lot of the literature would tend to describe project teams. They're more formalized, more structured. They've got defined outcomes. And when I talk about exit, for example, often there will be a planned exit to a point where there is the company becomes operational, or it becomes sold or closed down, right? So, there tends to be more of a collegial team, so a group of founders. A science startup will be a good example of this. And finally, there are venture teams, which I associate more with creative teams, where it's about an overriding creative venture and creativity. And so where this counts is that you're often dealing with creative specialism. So if you're building, well, it could be as simple as building a website where you've got designers and developers and so on, social media specialists kind of contributing to that, or it could be like a movie. So you imagine a movie being made. There are many different specialisms. Now, where this I think comes in is this is the model which was developed from the research, which talks about I know it's a complex model here, but if you can get into it and they say if you can kind of generate your own profile for free actually on the Pivomo site. There are essentially three major components which I've mentioned already. So there's mindset, which is right at the core of the model. I'll just go through this and flip back. There's social preferences, there's vertical access. Whether you want that agency and autonomy or whether you want to work collaboratively. And then finally, there's this dimension, which is the strategic to emergent, which is, are you planful, strategic, methodical on one side, or are you more emergent on the other? Now, the intersection of these three creates a four profiles. So the driver, dealer, director, and creator profile. So you can see there, this links to the 4 team types I mentioned earlier on. So driver profile, the driver entrepreneur profile will tend to build a mission team. That is people who work for them, often setting very high, very stretching goals. This is the kind of Silicon Valley founder. So when you read Silicon Valley type books, 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel or one, you're going to be reading, the assumption is that you are the founder setting huge goals, big transformational goals, and people are passionately committed to that, and they're extremely loyal to you. So there's a very sort of strong loyalty bond there. It's quite different in directorial teams with project teams, where it's actually much more, you might describe it as professional. There is much more kind of science, or and social science behind that. Some things like market research. Each of the directors, in a sense, is replaceable, whereas a driver is irreplaceable. So that makes a big difference. So whereas driver teams are comprised around people who are loyal to a particular CEO founder, in a project team, it is kind of, if a project member leaves, you can replace them. That might make some difference, and you have to rescope and so on. But it's not necessarily existential to the team, and that's why professional teams are composed in that way, right? So, and then you have the dealer teams, where they say there are networks, more hustling, connectivity, and so on, and they come together so consultants would be very much of this nature. So they deliver a project. So you build a pipeline and deliver a project which is run through deals. And finally, the creator, where there's a kind of creative network. And again, it's the important thing for creative teams is that it is the creative output at the end, which is the key. So it's very important to be aware of the different teams and behave appropriately. So for example, if you were a driver in a directorial team, you may come across as being extremely, what's the right word? Dominating. This is, drivers are not consensus builders, right? They are driving towards a passionately held view about how the world should be, right? Directors are much more kind of consent, there's almost like a committee structure where you're discussing what should happen and people have got to say and so on. So when you start combining these together, that's where the consistency comes in, being aware of your, if you like, the ecology of the team in which you're situated. Now, the other important thing about this is that I think startups do go through a journey, and this is the other really tricky part of this is that they don't stay this way. So you've got what's called, I would call it a Z flow, and then a reverse Z flow. And there's an N. So you can see where I'm going with this. So a Z flow would be driver sending out a vision, dealer. You then move to a dealer team, which is then searching for angel funding, VC funding. You've then got to build an infrastructure to manage that kind of investment, and then there's building the creative solution at the end of it. So you've got that kind of, and you migrate through 4 different types of teams. You can also go back the other way, which is a creative team developing a fascinating, beautiful product. You go to, you start building some infrastructure around that, start selling it, and then what happens sometimes is that the vision for a startup doesn't always manifest itself immediately, right? So it may be that you start, and there's actually an example of that in the case studies I'll talk about. So I'm going to move on. Any questions so far? Anybody totally confused, lost, wondering why they came on to anybody kind of just want to check in? I don't know. How are we doing, Harrison? Any sort of challenges, questions so far? Are we?
The chat looks like it's all good. Everyone's happy at the moment.
Good. Right. Okay. So and you'll have all these slides. So if I go too fast, you can always review this. So I'll go through this fairly quickly, so it should be apparent now. So if you look at the 4 profiles, so it starts to then dictate the kind of team structure you have. So one of the big differences, for example, is, and I think this is back to Lord Douglas, of course, is the control of IP, right? This is where, so for example, you might read a book about teams, and that's all nice and lovely and how you should be nice to each other and all the rest of it. But one thing that, you've got to get right is like who controls the intellectual property of a startup, right? How you allocate shares, right? These are really hard, tangible questions that you can't avoid. You need to have adult conversations about. Now, in a driver situation, it's pretty clear that the original founder is the shareholder and may actually not give out any equity at all. And you work either for nothing in some cases, which I don't philosophically happen to agree with, but it is not uncommon for startups to inspire people with a vision, and you're working with the expectation that at some point you do get angel VC funding, and you kind of cash in that way, and at that point you get sort of either cash bonuses or salaries or whatever. Now, so there is a tendency to therefore keep equity very closely held. So that has a big impact on the nature of the team. So drivers tend not to share out equity amongst a team of co-founders, unlike directors. So I think comprise that. Sorry, that's the last one here, where, for example, a directorial team will tend to have sort of stock options defined, and you might. So I can recall an LC team, for example, where they had 5 founders, and it creates its own problems because you had then each founder had 20% of the company. You can see where that goes, because then you've got problems of contribution and how do all 5 founders contribute equally, and what do you do with equity? You've used up all your equity, and how do you dilute, etc., etc. So there are problems there. But so the key kind of part of this is what kind of value the team is creating. So if I come back to the creator, so for example, the creator is more through licensing fees. So you might license creative content in some way, and there's creative IP, copyright recognition. So those sorts of things affect how you actually put a team together. Do you have rights of use and other things, and who draws income from the creative capital that's then licensed out? So so that's part of it. So there are particularly unique questions for startups that don't apply so much to corporate teams, where equity, of course, is held by the corporate entity. So you don't have to discuss who gets what equity, and and so on. So that there's and that also affects who you've got early on. You've got questions about voting rights and other things. I'll move on because obviously that gets a bit more technically complicated. But you can understand here some of the reasons why the workshops that you've been running, these themes come back in because they're not separate. So a conversation about how you allocate shareholder equity amongst a group of founders is directly related to teamwork, right? They're not separate questions, they're all interrelated, which is why startups are so damned hard, and you get those questions very early on in the cycle. Move on to some case examples here. So just talk through. So these are to illustrate these cases. Moviti was a AI startup. It's still thriving, actually doing really well, and it's actually one of the companies that continue to grow. The original founders, Riham and Vivek, are still driving it very successfully. They've done work recently with Transport for London. Moviti, they set out with a vision to democratize, but also remove cognitive bias in recruiting. And so they're using AI to do it. So they had a vision very early on. They used the Pivomo tool to identify, and in fact, one of the things that was difficult was they had, there was this question mark: who was actually going to be the driver? They had really smart people, actually creators who were, very strong in AI, but who was going to step up and drive the business and front it? And in fact, it was almost like a team decision. Like, well, I'll do that. There was one of the founders, Riham, actually said, well, I'll need to step up and be the front face of this venture. But it's so it doesn't help you identify the roles in the startup. So that was kind of very much a sort of mission-driven startup, which is still doing well. That's based in Oxford. Sporter is a network team. They Adam and Tony were Toby and Adam were LLC. This was actually won a competition. It's a sports aggregation site. And they were very networked company. They did sponsorship deals. So the entire focus of Sporter was almost outside the company. It was like it was really just a series of deals held together through various sort of licensing arrangements, and it was sort of very interesting. And so one of the challenges they had was to migrate to a more directorial team and build infrastructure and business plan and so on. So whenever you spoke to them, there was always some great deal in the pipeline, but actually what they needed to do was put together a business plan that actually explained where all this was going. So they were competition winners. Two Toys is interesting from a project point of view. There were three technologists, material scientists who developed Internet of Things technologies, applied it to toys, did some great work, won the NACU competition, I think it was in 2015, but quite happily exited. They sold the company, great exit. They wanted to do that. Wasn't their life to run this particular venture. They made some money out of it, sayonara bye, and what you've really got here is it was a good decision that actually in the toy business you've got you have to have a certain amount of investment to make that work. It's not something you can just it's much harder to do it without sort of strong backing from a financial investor. So actually selling out was made sense in their terms. So there was a strategic buyer who took it over. Competent is an interesting one because in a sense it came out of a team of architecture students, Amanda Campbell from UCL, and Competent was it was creative in the sense that they had a fabric that was compostable. But it came out of a sort of network of people who were interested in rock festivals, and they realised that this compostable material could create tents that could decompose, and also then it sort of went into things like refugee centres and other things, emergency use. So similarly, they've moved on to other things. So only one of these four is actually still running, but all four of them, I'd say, in the various ways were successful. So and that's an important message. They had the thing that I think governed all four of them was they had founders who kind of agreed on what the game plan was, and at what point would they stay with it, and what point would they leave. And I remember there were lots of conversations about that. It's not always obvious. You have to kind of, you don't quite know how things are going to turn out, but you have to be, ready to say, like, at this point we're going to sell. Okay. So questions for all of you, and these questions I'll leave you with, is, what's the most effective team you've belonged to? Because, we do bring our life experiences into this. I mean, many of you will be part of teams as sporting teams, or debating teams, or just loose groups of people who do things. So, all sorts of different experiences, and they matter because, that will shape your expectations of teams. Scouting would be a strong example. Those of you who've had scout experiences, often it's very strong sort of emphasis on very structured teams, quite formal teams often. So that's important. I think the second question will be, what kind of style team are you in now? Have you talked about it? Do you kind of have a conversation about, well, who are we? What are we as a team? How, what kind of team do we want to be? And what are some of the ground rules that we have? And how do you revisit those ground rules in the light of what's actually happening? And then, reflectively, what are you doing that kind of is benefiting the team? What are you kind of bringing to the team that's positive, but also what is it that's negative? So there is a bit kind of a sort of be really honest with yourself. And there are, and I think the context of that question is teams are continuously and always difficult. There's never a time when you think, well, we've got this sorted. When you hear people talk, we're just a great team, you kind of worry because it's like you take your eye off the ball. If there's always this balancing act with teams. And a need to invest in the team periodically and notice what's going on, notice the signals, and take early corrective action, and create a situation in which you can talk to each other as adults openly, without it becoming sort of locked into sort of schisms and blame and derailment behaviours, simply because actually there's very often that arises when there's just purely natural differences, perhaps differences in expectations, a different desire for an exit, a different motivational profile, which is perfectly natural, but it's not being discussed with the team. So I'll pause there, and I'll just leave you in the slide deck. There's Pivomo, it's actually slightly changed now, it's dark background, but anyway, but same thing. So it's available good on mobiles, and you can get instant results on your phone and access library materials. And there's the links there to both the Pivomo site and the Pivomo online learning site that would be migrating Pivomo onto the new Pivomo online learning site as soon as we can, but over the next 90 days is the plan. So, and if you want to kind of experience that in a fun way, and just kind of, you can download the game app. It's only £1.99. So, hopefully that's okay. You can access it on the Pivomo online learning homepage, or it's available on Apple and Google stores. So Harris, I don't know if you want to just pose those questions and see. I'm happy to field questions if there's time, and I know there's it depends on how you want to play it. So any questions? Anybody want to have a go at those questions? Yeah. Any questions on anything I've said? Any things I've not covered?
I think we're not getting much in the chat, but once again, I think that's because of the mix-up with the link.
Yeah, so there you go.
So yeah,
we're still challenged, aren't we, with online Zooming and so on. It's so yeah. I was on a call today where we actually were on separate Zoom rooms and we got eventually connected, but yeah, so it still does happen. So I'm happy to leave that with you, and you can use those questions or other questions, but hopefully that's prompted some thinking as amongst those of you who are involved in startups and various entrepreneurial activity, but how you can kind of get teams sorted and some of the issues that you need to surface when you build teams.
I've got some general leadership questions. Especially about conflict management. How would you go about dealing with conflict within a team, whether it's between you and another person or two people within your team that are conflict?
It happens a lot, and I've seen it. I remember when we did Social Storm, which is a 24-hour hackathon. It involved 20 odd universities around the world, but I was on site for over many years. We did this for several years in a row, and it's almost guaranteed to generate conflict because at 3 o'clock in the morning, when you suddenly realise there's a problem with your pitch deck and there's disagreement over numbers and so on, and it really does flare up, and it's a common situation. So I mean, the thing is that fatigue, that startups and people who run startups, when you're doing this often in conjunction with studying and working, which is the life many students lead, a startup is in conjunction with not just the study time, but also other commitments, and including family time and relationships, girlfriends, boyfriends, etc. It can cause fatigue. It can cause acute stress. So the most important thing to overcome conflict, and it's important to overcome conflict, because I know there's a kind of fashionable idea that conflict is good. I had a somewhat different view about that. I think confrontation is good. Surfacing things is good, and speaking directly and authentically is good. But I associate conflict with relational breakdown, where actually parties in that conflict can't talk to each other, and that isn't good. And I don't share the fashionable idea that we should encourage conflict. So the way to avoid it, to answer your question, is first of all, I think it's really important. Critical thinking is important. So, as an individual, thinking, how has this situation arisen? What are the circumstances in which, so even just going back over these times, just think, is this because we have different mindsets, different behaviors? Are we working in different ways? So, for example, that work style issue, it could be conflict can happen because certain ways of working, people just get annoyed with each other, right? So what is it saying? The second most important thing is empathy. Probably the most important thing is trying to see the situation from the other person's perspective. We so often just project motives onto others, and it becomes a dynamic. It becomes a vicious circle. In our minds, we kind of have convinced ourselves the other person is kind of wrong. And they're obviously wrong, and it's amazing how quickly and how firmly we can do that. I think the third thing I would mention is dialogue. Dialogue is not conversation. Conversation is a chat and conversation. Dialogue is at a deeper level. Dialogue is powerful and transformative. And actually, one of the things that can happen when you do confront these things early on is you can actually use it as a source of creativity and innovation in the team. So the fourth thing I'd mention is authenticity. So this last thing is that authenticity is important. If something's really bugging you, it is important to surface that as early as you can, as neutrally as you can. Describe, the classic process is situation, behavior, impact, right? Which actually is almost like it's one of the, if you use situation, behavior, impact, it's almost always guaranteed to it won't necessarily avoid conflict, but it will reduce the chances of that conflict occurring and minimize the degree of that conflict. So describe the situation that really causes you your concern or irritation. Use emotive words. This annoys me, or I'm disappointed, or I'm angry that. It's important to kind of use, don't sort of dance around. And people tend to argue over numbers and spreadsheets and PowerPoints and stuff. Actually, it's probably behaviors that are causing that. So be authentic. the second is, what are the behaviors that person is using? Be quite descriptive. What are the behavioral patterns that you're seeing, and finding what impact on you. So in this situation, these are the behaviors that I saw you using, and that's the impact it has on me. So I think that's a good way of staging the feedback. So I think in short, then, critical thinking, empathy, what else is there? Dialogue is crucial. Authenticity, and I would use a sort of word such as what I described there, situation behavior impact, really emotional intelligence. It's really kind of just handling conversations in intelligent ways. So those are the things I would suggest, Harrison. Nothing's guaranteed, but conflict can arise. I don't know if that helps, but
yeah, definitely. I think it's very important to be emotionally aware of what other people are thinking.
Yeah.
Cool. We've got 2 more questions in the chat. First one, 3 more questions in the chat. First one's from Domenico. What would you say is the best way to approach team building? Is it better to look for people who fit your culture, or should you focus on quantitative and qualitative capabilities?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I don't. I'm not a big fan actually of team building. This may contradict what I've just said actually, but I'm not. I think teams are built through work. I'm a bit of a traditionalist in that sense. I'm not a big fan of kind of like having a day where you sit around and talk about what kind of team you are, or sharing the abstract. I think it's so. I would. It may sound odd, but I would actually prefer the latter. I think it is about forming a team of people who can get things done. You start work. You focus on work activities. What's your goal? What are you trying to achieve, and so on. I mean, that is part of work, of course. And then you start moving into action. I wouldn't spend too long kind of philosophizing or navel gazing about from a team building point of view. And I say that having run team building events, because I think what you get into a situation where you've got this theory and practice, and sometimes the practice then just doesn't match the theory. It also creates impossible expectations for people, because in team building discussions about, say, culture and so on, you start idealizing, and people have to work in the real world, not so there's all sorts of trade-offs, as I mentioned earlier on. So I think what I would suggest, and I think this is I work with teams when I'm mentoring them, is a continuing dialogue. So get on with the work, get stuck in, but frequently and regularly talk about how you're working together as a team. And I think the idea is most teams don't have the luxury of forming teams, say, around culture, and then having the right technical fit. I think most teams have to kind of work off the idea that you kind of bring people together who can get certain things done, and that requires technical skills. And I think the important thing is how you can work with people with the right technical skills, not waiting for the perfect team to come along with the right cultural fit. That would be my. So I would bias to the latter, but make sure you talk a lot. And it's like any relationship, you just got to work at it, even if it's less than perfect.
Cool. Okay. Then a question from Jasmine. How did you overcome a specific challenge in your team? Could you explain with an example?
Yes, good question. So I'm trying to think of, I think there's, I'm just trying to think about when the most difficult, if I could think about the most difficult period. When I was running Marshall Goldsmith, we had a team of coaches and mentors, and it was going very well. We were selling projects. But one coach became very disruptive and actually started to act unethically towards clients. So one of the things that was difficult was I had to confront her and actually ask her to leave the team. And it was interesting. I did that. I made the call quite directly, and it was difficult because, in a sense, it wasn't a conversation about giving you a chance to explain. She'd done something that actually I believed actually completely broke the team, the ethics of the team, to the point I couldn't work with her. So that's an area which I would be really tough. Back to this first question, I would be really tough on ethics. Be uncompromising on ethics. So, for example, if you see a team member act in a disrespectful or diminishing way to another team member, whether through gender or racism or whatever, that would be totally unacceptable to me, and I would simply sever the relationship. Now, I might be a lot more severe about that than other people, but that was an episode, and it affected me quite profoundly, because there was such a profound breach of trust that I did find it difficult to trust others again. It took me a long time to rebuild trusted relationships. So what I now do, and I guess this is partly the way it shaped my thinking, is I now use more associate relationships rather than a kind of a equity-based team, and I spend a lot more time on structuring associates contracts. So I spend a lot more detail on what the terms of those contracts. I used to be quite affiliative and sort of, we work on a best endeavor basis and perhaps with some sketchy idea, and there was always a contract, but it was fairly vague. Now I nail it down specifically, and I'm much more specific about the expectations. I'm a bit more of a driver in that respect, in the sense that I've got strong beliefs about that, and I'm not very pragmatic in that sense. So that's the way I've dealt with it. So I've managed, in a sense. Now, and I also have to admit here, I'm not very good at. It's ironic your question to me, Harrison, about how to overcome. I'm not very good at overcoming conflict in that sense. I'm not. There are some people who can kind of confront that and through conversation and influence kind of manage other people. I'm not very good at. I tend to like to work with people who are, who kind of fit into a certain ethical approach. And so for me, trust is the most important thing. So to answer the question, the way it's affected me is that I have been much more sparing with who I trust, much more aware of who I worked with, and much more specific about the terms under which associate arrangements are formed. Yeah. Interestingly, by the way, just a footnote on that, I have actually recently formulated an equity team. So actually, Pivomo Online Learning, actually for the first time, does actually have the equity partners, but that has been structured in such a way that that there's a sort of probationary period and so on, so that so I spend much more time on those things. I don't know if that answers the question. I went on a bit long about that.
No, I think that definitely does. As you say, ethics are core to any effective team. Yeah. It's important to stick with them.
Yeah, I think it's one area that, so not all disagreements are simply misunderstandings. Sometimes they are, and that's why I took the reason I'm hesitating. At the time when I severed the relationship with this particular coach, there was a view that perhaps I should have given her another chance, or it was quite severe, or did I overreact? I'm pretty comfortable in my own skin that I didn't, because I think actually working in any kind of relationship would have been difficult. But it came across to others, perhaps not knowing the details of it, that it was a bit severe, a bit unfair, even though nobody disputed that what she'd done was wrong. But and I think sometimes you have to make those calls when you're running a venture, because particularly on the client side, particularly if it's to do with customers or clients. So.
Cool. Okay, so we're at time, but there's one more question, so I'm hoping we can squeeze this in. It's from Thomas. How often? Often small teams have overlapping responsibilities. How do you define roles in a small team during the early stages of a startup? And as you grow, would it be better to, in the short term, to increase the individual responsibilities or increase the team size? So there's two questions there.
Yeah. Well, and I'm going to cop out slightly on that question, because I think those, what you're identifying there are dimensions around all of those things are possible. These are tactical decisions that you make in the light of circumstances. So the first point is, I think the team roles early on, the dynamic tool which I've shown you actually is designed as a tool which says, broadly speaking, you can arrange team roles around not just those 4 areas, but if you drill down, there's actually 12 different role types, and they do help you identify, saying, okay, look, there's someone who needs to look after things like business planning and market research, and looking after perhaps the more professional end of putting a business together. There is somebody who's going to have to work on the vision and the ideas and the concept formation. There is someone who's going to have to work out and start building networks and relationships and growth hacking. And someone who's actually working on the creative product. So there's a rough idea of those 4 roles, and you can drill down it further. I think the answer is early on high levels of agility. So I think don't get too fixated on that. And one thing is important, I think, this idea of shareholders is try to differentiate your shareholding from your director role, from your working role, from your job. Right, that is important. So you've got, how much shares you have, and your role. Are you a director of the firm, named as a director? And then there's also what job you do, and try to distinguish those things, because, as a shareholder, you shouldn't, in a way, almost like do whatever job is needed to get the startup working, rather than necessarily taking something that's the what you enjoy doing or prefer to do. It's for the venture. So I think be very mindful of that. I think the key thing about taking on staff, I think, is be very careful about expanding too quickly. So this is where the network come in, is that having this network of people who can do short assignments, interim work, perhaps work very flexibly in a very ad hoc way, and build that up, rather than bringing on people into the venture. So I think sort of particularly be very careful. So first you've got to decide how many founders you have, how many people are actually directors, like they've got sort of decision-making authority over the venture, and then how many people are actually essentially earning, either salary-wise or in equity or in some other way. And you've got to be quite sparing in all 3 of those areas. But in particular, the thing you must guard against is diluting too quickly, with too many people having too big a stake in the equity, because that is a big deal. Some of the other things you can overcome, but bringing on too many co-founders, in my experience, is one of the biggest derailers. I don't know if that answers the question, but
yep, I reckon so.
All great points. Be very mindful of those things. I don't think there is a right or wrong answer in any of those things, but it's just be very conscious of it.
Cool. Okay, right. I think we should wrap up there. Andrew,
thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much for joining. And I hope those who are watching this either live or the recorded session enjoyed it and gained some information from it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we are.
Great, and see you on the Pivomo platform. And anybody email me or join me on LinkedIn and all those things. We can happy to follow up any questions if needed.
Wonderful. Okay. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
And you. Bye, everyone.